The morning sun rose pale and uncertain over the town of Dry Creek, washing the wooden storefronts in a dull amber light. Dust drifted lazily across the main street, kicked up by the wind and the hooves of a few restless horses tied to the hitching posts. It was the kind of morning that promised trouble, quiet on the surface, but heavy underneath. Inside the Whitmore boarding house, Clara Whitmore buttoned her faded blue dress with trembling fingers. The fabric was worn thin from years of washing, but she'd kept it clean and pressed. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked composed, but her heart was not. The letter on her dresser said everything. You are required to appear at the courthouse today to settle the estate and sign the documents as discussed. She didn't need to read between the lines to know what her uncle, Judge Barrow, meant. For months, he'd been tightening his grip on her life. Little by little, first taking over her father's land when the old man died, then selling off the livestock, then insisting Clara stay under his care since she had no husband to protect her. He spoke of duty, of propriety, but his eyes always gleamed when he mentioned Mr. Harlan Pike, the rancher twice Clara's age who'd been courting her against her will. Harlan wasn't the kind of man to ask for a woman's heart. He preferred to buy it, like cattle or land. And Judge Barrow, deep in debt after gambling away the family fortune, had decided to sell Clara's future to save his own skin, downstairs. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Rowe, wrung her hands as Clara descended the steps. "Child, you don't have to go," she whispered. "You could run. Head west. There's folks who'd take you in." Clara forced a small smile, though her throat felt tight. "If I run, he'll send men after me. The judge doesn't like to lose what he thinks belongs to him." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters as Clara stepped into the street. The townsfolk glanced her way but quickly looked down again. Everyone knew the judge's temper. No one wanted to be next on his bad side. The sound of her boots against the wooden walkway echoed too loud, too lonely. By the time she reached the courthouse, her pulse was a steady drumbeat. The two men waiting at the door, Barrow's deputies, tipped their hats, though the gesture felt more like mockery than respect. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," one said with a smirk. "The judge has been expecting you." Inside, the air was hot and stale. Judge Barrow sat behind his desk, papers spread before him, his white mustache twitching in impatience. Beside him stood Harlan Pike, his vest stretched over his thick belly, his fingers tapping the butt of a gold watch. "Clara, my dear," Barrow said, his tone slick as oil, "we'll make this quick. All you have to do is sign these papers, and everything will be settled. You'll be well taken care of, a fine home, a husband to keep you safe." Clara's eyes darted to the papers. The words blurred, but she could make out marriage certificate in bold letters. Her stomach turned cold. "You told me these were property documents," she said softly. Barrow's smile thinned. "Don't be foolish, girl. You should be grateful. This is the only respectable path left for you." Clara took a slow breath. The room felt smaller by the second, the walls closing in. Every instinct told her she was walking into a trap, one carefully laid, with ink instead of chains. Outside the window, a single horse rode past, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara didn't know it yet, but that sound, that lone rider's rhythm, would be the first hint of her salvation. The courthouse smelled faintly of ink, whiskey and old wood, a place meant for justice, but long ago twisted into a den of intimidation. The morning light filtered through the windows in narrow beams, catching the floating dust and the silver glint of the pen. Judge Barrow laid on the desk before Clara Whitmore. The paper sat waiting. Thick parchment, crisp edges, the town seal pressed deep into the corner. They looked official, righteous even, but Clara knew better. Those papers weren't law. They were chains, written in the language of deceit. Judge Barrow leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "All that's needed is your signature, my dear," he said smoothly, though his eyes held the cold calculation of a man cornered by his own debts. "Then the estate is settled, your father's name preserved, and you can begin your new life as Mrs. Pike." Clara's fingers trembled at her sides. Across from her, Harlan Pike shifted impatiently. His thick hands rested on his belt, the skin sunburned and scarred from years on the range. But there was nothing honorable about him. His gaze crawled over Clara with the entitlement of a man who thought he was owed something. "I ain't got all day, Judge," Pike grumbled. "Got cattle to tend. Let's make this legal so I can take her home." Those words hit Clara like a slap. Take her home. Like she was an object to be handed off, not a woman with a will of her own. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't sign." The room went still. The deputies guarding the door exchanged glances. Barrow's jaw twitched, the only crack in his polished mask. Then, with forced patience, he said, "You're upset, Clara, I understand. But this isn't up for debate. You're a woman alone, with no means, no property, no protection. The town can't support you." "I've supported myself for 2 years," she shot back. "The schoolhouse, the children, that's enough for me." Barrow's tone hardened. "You think teaching a handful of brats will keep you fed through winter? Don't be naive." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Your father left debts too. If you don't sign, I'll have no choice but to declare you unfit. You'll be placed under guardianship until you come to your senses." Clara froze. She knew what that meant: confinement, shame, and the end of everything she'd fought to hold on to since her father's death. Her hand drifted toward the papers, hovering over the pen. The ink shimmered black, waiting to swallow her name. She could feel Harlan Pike's grin, the smug victory curling his lips, but something inside her, something her father had taught her long ago on the prairie, refused to die quietly. She took a shaky breath, lifted her chin, and met her uncle's eyes. "You may own this town," she said, "but you will never own me." Barrow's hand slammed the table, rattling the inkwell. "Enough!" His voice boomed through the courthouse. "You'll sign, or I'll have the sheriff drag you back here tomorrow in irons." The sound of boots on the porch outside made everyone turn their heads. The double doors creaked under a gust of wind. Dust swirled across the floorboards, catching in the light. Clara's heart skipped. Somewhere in that sudden silence, there was the soft jingle of spurs, slow, steady, deliberate. Judge Barrow frowned. "Who in blazes is that?" But Clara already felt it, a strange calm amid the terror, a sense that the world had just shifted. Whoever was outside wasn't another one of Barrow's men. No, this was someone else. Someone who'd heard enough. The courthouse felt like a cage. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of ink and fear. Clara Whitmore stood frozen at the desk, the marriage papers before her like a silent threat. The world outside seemed to fade. Only the ticking of the wall clock, the scrape of Judge Barrow's pen, and the pounding of her own heartbeat remained. Judge Barrow leaned forward, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Clara, my dear, don't make a fool of yourself. You've been difficult enough already. Sign the papers, and this will all be over." His tone was calm, but his hand, tapping the desk, betrayed his irritation. He wasn't used to being told no, not by anyone, and certainly not by a young woman he considered helpless. Clara stared down at the page. The ink shimmered black under the morning light, ready to swallow her name forever. Just one stroke of her pen, and she'd be Mrs. Harlan Pike, a man she neither loved nor trusted, a man who'd already spoken of her as if she were livestock to be traded. Her chest tightened. Every sensible voice inside her told her to obey, to sign and survive. But another voice, smaller, fiercer, born from her father's blood, whispered that survival wasn't worth the price of a soul. Judge Barrow's tone sharpened. If you refuse, I'll have you declared unfit. A woman who disobeys her guardian cannot manage her own affairs. You'll be sent to the asylum in St. Joseph by sundown. The words struck like a whip. Clara's knees wobbled. The deputies at the door looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. Everyone in town knew the judge could make such threats real. He'd done it before, locking away anyone who dared to challenge him. Still, Clara found her strength where she least expected it, in the memory of her father teaching her to ride bareback across the plains, the wind tearing through her hair as he shouted, "Don't you ever let fear steer your reins." Her trembling stopped. Slowly she lifted her gaze to meet Barrow's. "No," she said. Barrow blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of the word. "What did you say?" "I said no." Clara's voice shook, but it held. "I will not sign. You can threaten, you can lie, but you cannot make me yours to sell." A stunned silence followed. Even Harlan Pike seemed caught off guard. His sunburned face turned red with anger. "Girl, you don't know what's good for you. You'll regret." "I already regret the day I trusted any of you," she snapped, her voice rising. "You think being a woman makes me weak? Then you've never seen what a woman can do when she's been pushed too far." Judge Barrow stood abruptly, the chair screeching across the floor. "Enough of this madness." He motioned to his deputies. "Hold her hand steady if you must. She will sign, and she will sign now." One of the deputies hesitated. "Judge, maybe," I said now. The second man stepped forward, reaching for Clara's wrist. She jerked back, knocking over the inkwell. Black ink splattered across the papers, bleeding into the word marriage. The crowd of onlookers gasped. Clara's heart thundered. For a moment, she thought Barrow might strike her, his hand lifted, trembling with rage. Then, before he could move, a sound cut through the tense air, a slow, measured step across the wooden porch outside. Spurs jingled softly with each footfall. The doors creaked under a gust of wind, and the smell of dust and horse leather drifted in. Every head turned. Barrow's voice faltered. "Who?" The doors burst open. Light poured through the dust. And standing there, tall and steady as a mountain, was a stranger in a worn duster coat, a shadow against the sun. His eyes swept the room, hard as steel dot, and when they met Clara's for the first time that morning, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The doors of the courthouse swung open with a thunderous crack that echoed through the still air. Dust swept in like a living thing, curling around boots that had seen too many miles, and around the tall figure who stood framed in sunlight. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. His silence filled the room more powerfully than Judge Barrow's shouting ever could. The townsfolk, frozen in their seats, recognized him even before he lowered his hat. Wyatt Cole, the drifter cowboy who'd once been a foreman at the Dalton Ranch before he walked away after a dispute over a beaten farmhand. Folks said he had a temper for justice and a taste for solitude. Others said he had nothing left to lose. Wyatt's eyes, pale gray and sharp as a winter dawn, took in everything. The ink-stained papers, Clara's trembling stance, the deputy's uneasy hands, and Barrow's red face behind the desk. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally. Voice low, calm, the kind that made men stop talking and start listening. "But it looked to me like this lady wasn't signing of her own will." Judge Barrow bristled. "Who are you to interfere in lawful business, mister? This is an official proceeding under my Haim jurisdiction." Wyatt's gaze didn't move from Clara. "Then your jurisdiction's mighty strange if it includes forcing women into marriage." A ripple of whispers moved through the onlookers. Harlan Pike's face twisted into a sneer. "This ain't your concern, cowboy. Go on back to whatever saloon you crawled out of. Wyatt stepped further into the room, boots scuffing against the floorboards. He was unarmed except for the revolver holstered at his hip, but the way he carried himself made it clear he didn't need to draw to command respect. "Lady," he said to Clara. His tone gentler now. "Do you want to sign those papers?" Clara swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No, I don't." Wyatt turned his gaze back to the judge. "Then it's over." Barrow's lips curled into a cold smile. "You must be new around here, Mr. Cole. You don't tell me when something's over. This is my court, my town." He nodded toward his deputies. "Remove him." The two men at the door hesitated. They weren't cowards, but they'd seen something in Wyatt's eyes, the kind of steady, quiet that came from someone who'd buried more than one man. Wyatt didn't move his hand toward his gun. Instead, he took a step closer to the judge's desk. His boots thudded slow and even, each one like a drumbeat. "You've got a lot of fancy words for a man who hides behind a desk." Barrow stood, red-faced with fury. "You'll regret this. I'll have you jailed before the hour's out." Wyatt's hand reached across the desk, fast as lightning, and snatched the stack of papers. For a moment, the entire room froze. Then, without breaking eye contact with the judge, Wyatt tore the marriage papers clean in half. The sound of ripping parchment was deafening. Clara gasped softly. The deputy shifted uneasily. Even Harlan Pike looked momentarily stunned. Wyatt let the torn pieces flutter to the ground. "Ain't no law worth following if it's written in lies," he said simply. For the first time in years, someone had stood up to Judge Barrow and lived to say it. Barrow's voice shook with rage. "You have no idea what you've just done." Wyatt finally looked toward the door, the sunlight still blazing behind him. "Yeah," he said. "I do." He tipped his hat toward Clara. "Ma'am." Then he turned, the wind catching his duster coat as he stepped outside. The room stayed silent long after he'd gone, but in that silence, something began to shift. The people of Dry Creek, who'd bowed to fear for so long, felt a spark stir in their chests, and Clara, standing amid the torn papers, felt her heart beat with something fierce and knew it was the sound of freedom, faint, fragile, but real. The door swung on its hinges, banging against the frame as a gust of wind rolled through the courthouse. Dust and silence followed the cowboy's departure, silence so sharp it could cut. Judge Barrow stood motionless, fists trembling on the table, his pride torn apart along with the marriage papers now scattered at his feet. Clara Whitmore still couldn't move. She stood in the same spot, ink splattered across her hands, heart pounding so hard it hurt. What had just happened felt unreal. One moment she'd been trapped, the next freed by a stranger who'd walked in like something out of a prayer she hadn't dared to say. Barrow's face turned a deeper shade of red. "Find him," he barked, slamming his palm against the desk. "Bring him back here this instant." The deputies shifted, uneasy. They'd seen the look in Wyatt Cole's eyes, calm as the sky before a storm. Men like that didn't scare easily. One of them finally muttered, "Judge, maybe we ought to let it be. The papers are ruined. We can draw up new ones tomorrow." Barrow turned on him, his voice a growl. "You think I'll let some saddle tramp make a fool of me in my own court? Go after him." The deputies hesitated again. Their boots scraped the floor, but they didn't move fast enough. Barrow's fury was a living thing now, pacing behind the desk. He grabbed the broken papers and threw them aside. Harlan Pike, red-faced and humiliated, stepped forward. "This ain't over, Judge. You promised me that girl, and I expect you to deliver." Clara flinched. Pike's words dripped with entitlement, like she was property to be reclaimed. Barrow's jaw tightened. "You'll get her, Harlan. Don't you worry. That cowboy won't be around long enough to interfere again." But outside, Wyatt hadn't gone far. He stood on the courthouse steps, watching the horizon, one hand resting lightly on his revolver. He'd heard the shouting inside and knew it wasn't over. He never expected gratitude. He just couldn't stomach injustice, not when he saw it up close. Inside, the air grew thick again. Barrow marched toward Clara. "You think that man saved you? He's nothing but a drifter, a nobody. He'll leave town by dusk, and then you'll come crawling back, begging for protection." Clara's chin lifted. Her fear was still there, but it had changed. It had turned into something hard and steady. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "He gave me back my voice, and you can't take that again." Barrow's hand twitched. For a moment, it looked as though he might strike her. But before he could, the door burst open again, this time with force that rattled the windows. Wyatt Cole strode back in. His duster coat flared behind him, dust swirling in his wake. His revolver was drawn now, gleaming under the lamplight. The deputies froze mid-step. "Judge," Wyatt said evenly, "I told you it was over." "Guess you didn't hear me the first time." Barrow sputtered. "You dare threaten an officer of the law?" Wyatt's gaze didn't waver. "You're no lawman. You're a thief with a gavel." He turned to Clara, voice softening. "Ma'am, you ready to leave this place?" Clara nodded slowly, eyes wide. She didn't need to be asked twice. Barrow roared, "Stop them." But no one moved. The deputies looked down, ashamed. The townsfolk who'd gathered outside peered through the door, murmuring, watching the scene unfold. Wyatt extended his hand. Clara hesitated only a second before taking it. His palm was rough, warm, steady, the first touch of safety she'd felt in years. Together they stepped toward the open door. Behind them, Barrow shouted curses into the wind, his voice lost to the rising dust. Harlan Pike lunged forward, but Wyatt turned, his revolver raised just enough to freeze him mid-step. "Try it," Wyatt warned, voice low. Pike stopped cold. Then Wyatt led Clara out into the sunlight, down the courthouse steps, and toward his waiting horse, the wind snapping through her hair like freedom itself. And for the first time, the people of Dry Creek saw a woman walk away from Judge Barrow's courthouse without his permission. The street outside the courthouse was still as a held breath. Dust floated in the late afternoon light, golden and slow. The people of Dry Creek stood in doorways and on porches, watching in silence as Wyatt Cole led Clara Whitmore down the steps. Behind them, Judge Barrow's furious shouts echoed through the open door. "You can't walk away from me. She's mine by law, and you'll hang for interfering." Wyatt didn't turn around. His hand stayed steady on Clara's shoulder, guiding her toward his horse. The sound of his spurs against the wood planks was the only rhythm in the tense silence. "Where will we go?" Clara whispered. "Anywhere that ain't here," Wyatt said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard as steel. Then came the metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. They both stopped when Wyatt turned. He saw Harlan Pike standing in the middle of the street, pistol in hand, his vest straining against his belly, his face red with rage and humiliation. Behind him, Judge Barrow stepped into the doorway, flanked by his two deputies. Barrow's voice was sharp and cruel. "End of the line, Cole. You've meddled enough. Put your hands up, or I'll have you shot where you stand." The townsfolk drew back, retreating into the shadows of their porches. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe. Wyatt sighed softly and turned fully to face them. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't even reach for his gun. He just looked at Barrow and said quietly, "That's enough." Barrow sneered. "You don't give the orders here, cowboy." "Maybe not," Wyatt said, stepping forward, voice calm but heavy with authority. "But I'm done watching men like you break people and call it law." He pointed to the courthouse behind them. "You sit in there, selling women's futures like cattle. You call that justice?" Barrow's face twitched. "You don't understand how this town works. I understand plenty, Wyatt interrupted. I understand fear when I see it. You've ruled by it so long, you forgot what respect looks like. A murmur stirred among the onlookers. The blacksmith, Eli Barnes, stepped out from his shop, wiping his hands on his apron. He's right, Judge. We've all seen what you done. Barrow's gaze snapped toward him. You'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you. But another voice rose, the widow Mrs. Hensley, clutching her shawl. We've all kept quiet too long. The murmurs grew louder. The tension, once suffocating, began to shift. The people of Dry Creek, cowed for years, were beginning to stir. Pike, realizing the crowd was slipping from Barrow's control, snarled and aimed his gun at Wyatt. You talk too much. The shot came fast, but Wyatt was faster. His revolver flashed, a blur of silver. One sharp crack echoed through the street, and Pike's pistol went spinning from his hand, clattering onto the dirt. Wyatt didn't fire again. He didn't need to. Pike stumbled back, clutching his bleeding wrist, cursing under his breath. Wyatt's eyes turned to Barrow once more. I said that's enough. This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a reckoning. Barrow's hand hovered near his coat pocket, but he didn't draw. He looked around and saw the crowd, the very people he'd ruled with fear, standing against him. The deputy stepped back, uncertain. Wyatt holstered his revolver and turned to Clara. Go on, get your things. We're leaving. Clara hesitated, tears shining in her eyes. What about them? She whispered, glancing toward the crowd. Wyatt gave a small smile. Looks like they're finding their voices again. Barrow shouted after them, voice cracking with rage, but it no longer carried weight. The spell he'd held over the town had finally begun to break, and as Wyatt and Clara walked away, the whispers grew, not in fear, but in courage. The people of Dry Creek had witnessed something they couldn't unsee. A man standing up for what was right. And for the first time, they believed they could too. The air in Dry Creek felt charged like lightning before a storm. For years, the townsfolk had lived beneath Judge Barrow's heavy hand, obeying every order, paying every unfair tax, turning away whenever his men bullied or took what wasn't theirs. But now, as Wyatt Cole stood firm in the middle of Main Street with Clara Whitmore beside him, something in that silence began to crack. The people had seen it with their own eyes. The cowboy facing down the judge. The gunman Harlan Pike disarmed and humiliated. The courthouse papers torn and scattered like confetti in the wind. For once, the fear that had kept them quiet didn't feel so big anymore. Judge Barrow, red-faced and furious, tried to seize it back. He turned to the crowd, raising his arms like a preacher at revival. This man is a criminal. He shouted, his voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. He's a drifter, a troublemaker. He's here to stir up rebellion and destroy this town's peace. No one answered. Wyatt stood calm, hand resting on the butt of his revolver but not drawing it. Peace? He said quietly. You call this peace when women are sold like cattle and men live too scared to speak their minds. Barrow's lip curled. Order must be kept. Order, Wyatt said, ain't worth much if it's built on fear. The crowd murmured. The blacksmith, Eli Barnes, stepped forward, his thick arms folded across his chest. He's right, Judge. We've been letting you rob us blind and bully us for years. Barrow's eyes snapped toward him. Careful, Barnes. You've got a wife and children. You don't want to make an enemy of me. Eli didn't flinch. You already are. The words rippled through the crowd like fire catching dry brush. Mrs. Hensley, the widow who ran the bakery, spoke next. My husband died because of your lies, Barrow. You told the sheriff to look the other way when Pike's men jumped him for speaking out. I've kept my mouth shut since, but no more. Barrow's face drained of color. He turned to his two deputies. Arrest them. All of them. starting with that woman. But the deputies didn't move. Their eyes flicked between Barrow and Wyatt, between fear and conscience. Finally, one of them lowered his rifle. "Judge, maybe we've done enough arresting for you." The other followed suit, setting his badge on the ground. "You ain't law, not anymore." Barrow's control began to crumble. "You'll regret this," he roared, his voice cracking. "Every one of you will." Wyatt took a step closer, his boots stirring up dust. "You're finished, Barrow. You can't bully a whole town forever." Barrow reached for his pistol, and before anyone could move, Wyatt's revolver was out, trained steady on him. The tension in the street went razor sharp. "Don't," Wyatt said softly. "You're not that kind of man. You don't have the courage to fight without your title." For a long moment, the judge's hand hovered near his gun, then he let it fall. His power, his pride, everything he'd built on fear had vanished before the eyes of the very people he'd ruled. Wyatt holstered his revolver. He looked to the crowd. "This town don't need a man like him running it anymore. You've all got a choice now, live by his fear or stand on your own feet." The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was strength. Eli Barnes stepped forward first. Then Mrs. Hensley. Then half a dozen others. Soon, the whole street was filled with townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder behind Wyatt and Clara. Barrow stumbled backward, pale and sweating. "You think you can take this town from me? You think one cowboy can change everything?" Wyatt's gaze was steady. "No," he said, "but they can." And for the first time in years, Judge Barrow understood the one thing he'd never believed possible. The town of Dry Creek wasn't his anymore. The street of Dry Creek had never been so alive or so tense. Dust swirled through the air, kicked up by the boots of townsfolk who now stood shoulder to shoulder behind Wyatt Cole, forming a wall of quiet defiance against Judge Barrow and his remaining loyal men. The courthouse loomed behind Barrow, its doors wide open like a gaping maw, a silent witness to years of corruption now exposed. Barrow's face was crimson with fury, his hands shaking. "You think you can defy me? Do you think your little crowd will protect you?" His voice roared over the street, but there was a quiver of fear hidden beneath the rage. Harlan Pike, nursing his wounded wrist from Wyatt's previous disarm, glared from the steps of the courthouse. "I'll settle this myself if that cowboy doesn't," he snarled, reaching for another pistol tucked into his belt. Wyatt's eyes swept the crowd, measuring distance and angles. He didn't panic. Panic had never served him. He glanced at Clara, whose hands were clenched at her sides, and whispered, "Stay close. Don't move until I say." Barrow's deputies, once pillars of obedience, now wavered, their guns trembling in hesitant hands. They were torn between loyalty to a corrupt judge and the undeniable courage of the people around them. The tension was a living thing, thick enough to choke. Then a shot rang out, sharp, ringing across the wooden buildings. Dust leapt from the street as the bullet buried itself into the doorframe. Panic shot through the crowd. Wyatt reacted instantly, pulling Clara behind him as he drew his revolver. Pike fired again, desperate and unsteady. Wyatt returned fire, precise, controlled. The gunshot echoed, a single decisive note in the symphony of chaos. Pike dropped to the ground, clutching his arm, shouting curses that were swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Barrow's eyes widened. "You dare!" Another shot cracked, this time from Eli Barnes, the blacksmith, who had taken a rifle from his shop. The weapon barked, forcing Barrow to duck behind the courthouse steps. The crowd, now emboldened, murmured and stepped forward, their fear melting into action. Clara's heart pounded as Wyatt stood firm in the middle of the street. His eyes didn't waver from the judge. "It's over, Barrow. You've had your chance." Barrow roared in fury and desperation, trying to rally his men, but it was too late. The townsfolk had chosen sides, the side of justice, courage, and freedom. Even the two deputies who had remained loyal wavered, realizing the judge's hold was broken. Gunfire echoed intermittently, punctuated by the clang of metal and the scuffle of boots. Dust and smoke filled the street. Clara could barely see through the haze, but she felt Wyatt's steady presence beside her, a shield against the chaos. He didn't panic. He moved with the confidence of a man who had seen and survived far worse. Barrow tried to flee toward the courthouse, but a collective voice from the townsfolk shouted him down. No more. He stumbled, tripping over a loose board, and froze as the crowd closed in. His authority had crumbled in minutes. He had relied on fear to control others, but fear alone could not stand against courage multiplied by unity. Wyatt holstered his revolver, surveying the street. Pike groaned from the dirt, and the judge's remaining men had surrendered or fled. Dust rose around the defeated tyrants, mingling with the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Clara let out a long breath, her knees finally giving way to relief. The standoff was over, the violence spent, but the lesson remained: tyranny could be broken, but only when the oppressed found their own courage. Wyatt turned to her, voice low but warm. You all right? Clara nodded, tears of relief and exhaustion in her eyes. Thanks to you. I think I am. For the first time in years, Dry Creek felt like it could breathe. The townsfolk stepped forward cautiously, helping one another recover, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear, awe, and newfound determination. They had witnessed the impossible, the powerless rising against injustice, and they would never forget it. As Wyatt mounted his horse, Clara followed, the chaos fading behind them. Dust and smoke lingered in the streets, but so did hope, courage, and the promise of freedom. The standoff had ended, but a new era in Dry Creek had just begun. The sun had dipped low behind the rolling hills, painting the plains in shades of gold and crimson as Wyatt Cole guided his horse along a narrow dirt trail. The dust of Dry Creek clung stubbornly to their boots, and Clara Whitmore's dress rustled in the wind. Every so often, she glanced back at the distant town, still smoldering with the echoes of chaos, and felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Wyatt rode beside her in calm silence. He hadn't spoken much since leaving the street alive with tension and gunfire. Words weren't necessary. His presence alone was steadying. Clara could feel it, the quiet strength, the kind of assurance that didn't demand obedience. Only trust. After several miles, the pair reached a clearing where a small, weathered log cabin stood beneath a stand of tall pines. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying with it the comforting scent of burning wood. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, a haven in a world that had threatened to crush her. Wyatt dismounted first, tossing the reins of the horses to Clara. His hands were callous but careful as he helped her down. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether it was truly safe. The memory of the courthouse, Judge Barrow, and Harlan Pike lingered like shadows in her mind. You can let your guard down here, Wyatt said quietly, noting the tension in her shoulders. His eyes were soft now, the hard edge of confrontation replaced by patience. I promise no one will find you here unless we want them to. Clara nodded, slowly relaxing. She stepped into the cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. Inside, a small fire had been stoked, the flames dancing across the rough-hewn walls. A few simple furnishings, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot pushed into the corner, suggested that this was a temporary refuge, but one that offered safety, warmth, and perhaps the beginnings of something more. Wyatt pulled off his dusty coat and hung it near the door. He turned to Clara, studying her face. You've been through hell today, he said, his voice low and steady. And well, I won't pretend I understand it all, but I can promise this. No one will ever force you into anything while I'm around. Clara swallowed, fighting back tears. She had spent years feeling trapped, first by her father's death, then by Judge Barrow's greed, and finally by the looming threat of Pike's claim. Now, for the first time, she felt a flicker of relief, a fragile sense that she might finally be able to breathe. "Thank you," she whispered, voice small but genuine. I didn't know anyone could care like that." Wyatt's gaze softened, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt to check the horses outside, ensuring they were unharmed and ready for the journey ahead. When he returned, he handed Clara a small cup of water. His movements deliberate and careful. They sat together by the fire, neither rushing the moment, both aware of the silence that had settled comfortably between them. In that quiet, Clara began to feel something she hadn't allowed herself in years: trust. And with trust came a tentative hope, fragile but alive, that maybe she wasn't as powerless as she had believed. Wyatt broke the silence first. "I've seen a lot of people lose themselves to fear," he said softly, staring into the flames. "But not you. You fought. You stood your ground. That's worth more than most people realize." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." Wyatt shook his head. "No, you could have. You just needed someone to remind you what it felt like to be free." The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of safety and a new beginning. And inside, amidst the warmth of the small cabin, Clara and Wyatt found a quiet understanding, a bond forged in danger, trust, and the hope that tomorrow might finally bring peace. It was more than survival. It was a promise to protect, to stand firm, and to face whatever came next, together. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the plains in muted gold and lavender. Dry Creek lay quiet, the tension of the previous days settling into an uneasy calm. From the ridge above town, Wyatt Cole and Clara Whitmore could see the courthouse, its windows catching the morning sun like eyes wide open. Aware that change had finally arrived, Clara felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Today was the day the town would confront the corruption that had ruled it for years. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, the wind cold against her cheeks, and met Wyatt's steady gaze. "Are we ready?" she asked softly. Wyatt nodded. "We don't just ride in and shout. We show them that fear doesn't run this town anymore, that they have a choice." His tone carried both resolve and reassurance. They rode down the trail toward Main Street, the quiet morning amplifying the sound of their horses' hooves against the dirt. The townsfolk were stirring, doors creaked open, heads peeked out from behind shutters, and whispers carried through the crisp air. People had spent decades fearing Judge Barrow, but today they dared to hope. At the courthouse, Barrow stood at the steps, his face pale and drawn, aware that his time of unchecked power had come to an end. Harlan Pike lingered behind him, nursing his injured arm and glaring at Wyatt, hatred and frustration etched into every line of his weathered face. Wyatt dismounted first, offering Clara a hand. She followed, determined but cautious, feeling the weight of what was to come. Barrow's voice cracked the silence. "This town belongs to me. I have the law, and I will enforce it." Wyatt stepped forward, calm but commanding. "No, Barrow. You had fear, threats, and lies. That's what you called law. But law isn't written on paper you rip up. Law is about justice, and justice is what the town deserves." A hush fell. The townsfolk began to step forward, one by one. The blacksmith, the widow, even a few of the farmers who had suffered quietly under Barrow's edicts. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants in their own liberation. Barrow sputtered, trying to assert control, but the momentum had shifted. Wyatt's words had ignited something the town had long suppressed: courage. Clara took a tentative step forward, holding a small stack of documents she had carried from the courthouse. With steady hands, she placed them on the steps. These were evidence, receipts, accounts, and sworn statements proving Barrow's corruption, Pike's coercion, and the judge's pattern of intimidation. Wyatt addressed the crowd. This is the truth. You've lived in fear, but now you can choose to stand for yourselves. Barrow's time is done. The townsfolk murmured agreement, swelling into voices of defiance that echoed off the wooden buildings. Barrow's face turned ashen. "You'll pay for this," he shouted, but no one answered. His power had crumbled, replaced by unity and resolve. By mid-morning, the local sheriff, once hesitant to challenge Barrow, stepped forward, presenting the evidence Clara had brought. Barrow's crimes were undeniable. Pike was arrested for coercion, and the judge himself faced charges of corruption and abuse of power. As the arrests were made, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced the court, faced Barrow, and stood firm. No longer a pawn, no longer afraid. Wyatt stood beside her, his hand brushing lightly against hers. A silent affirmation that she was safe, that she had allies, and that the world could still hold good men and women, later. In the quiet that followed, Wyatt asked her the question she had long feared. He offered his hand and spoke softly, "Clara, would you marry me?" This time, Clara smiled, heart steady, eyes clear. She took the pen in her own hand, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The ink scratched across the paper, marking not just a marriage, but her freedom, her voice, and her future. The sun rose higher, illuminating a town reborn. Dry Creek was no longer ruled by fear, and Clara Whitmore, once trapped by greed and cruelty, finally walked forward into a life she had chosen, one written with courage, love, and hope.